Okay, we are recording. Okay. Hello and welcome to this week's HealthTech Hour with me, Steve Roest, on UK Health Radio, the world's #1 talk health radio. Each week, we bring you the best news, views, and interviews with the people and companies that are changing the world of health tech in the UK and beyond. I want to say thank you to everyone that's listening live on UK Health Radio. I want to say thank you to everyone that's listening on Spotify, and I want to say thank you to everyone that's watching on YouTube. So we've got now well over 1,000 subscribers, and we're doing really well across all the platforms. So thank you very much to everyone there. I also want to say thanks to my company PocDoc, who have partnered with this show to make this show possible. We have just received our CA marking certification for our first lipid test, smartphone-based lipid test, which is very exciting. And we've recently won a Novartis award, which is called the Novartis Heart Health Catalyst. So all very exciting, everything at PocDoc. Thank you very much there. So today is a first for the show. We've got someone from the leading industry body of health technology in the UK, which is the Association of British HealthTech Industry. We've not had anyone from an industry body on the show before, so it's going to be really exciting to get a very unique perspective across the whole industry. Obviously, we are called the HealthTech Hour, so someone from the HealthTech Industry Association seems highly relevant in terms of subject matter. So I just want to welcome Richard Phillips, who's the Strategy Director at the ABHI, so the Association of British HealthTech Industry, to the show. Welcome, Richard. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very well, thank you. Thanks for inviting us, Steve. It's great to be here, and congratulations on your CA marking. Yeah, we'd like to speak to you about that at some point. Actually, I'm sure a lot of our members would be interested in your experiences. Yeah,
well, we are a member in waiting of the ABHI. Put it that way. We've got to get to it. So,
but again, post, I get it.
Yeah. But it's really great to have you on, and I think you were definitely one of the people that we wanted to have on the show to provide a kind of unique industry perspective on things, because trade industry bodies have a unique perspective, kind of deliberately on that, in the sense that they represent such a broad church, right? Because health technology is an extremely broad church, encompasses all kinds of different things, from syringes up to, X-ray scanners and, everything in between. So how would you, just to start with, just to bring everyone onto the same kind of bit of paper, what is the mission of the ABHI?
Well, I mean, you've described the sector really well, Steve. Actually, it is incredibly diverse. You call it a broad church. I was actually helping the DIT out, the Department for International Trade, out earlier in the week at a conference, a global market access conference. They have people all over the globe helping companies like yours and others export literally around the world. There were people from all corners of the globe. I describe the sector as a basket case versus.
Okay, slightly less. Yeah.
People often look at us and think, "Our pharmaceuticals are the same as pharmaceuticals," and we're absolutely not. It's that incredibly diverse range of products. And for people listening, maybe not as familiar, you'll think about. I always used to say, when people ask me, "What is the health tech all about?" So we define health tech as medical devices, diagnostics, like something, including the stuff you're talking about, the P and the stick, P and the pot stuff, lipid tests, which we all had, the COVID test we grow to know and love, all that kind of stuff, plus the big imaging, which you mentioned, as well as big machines you get wheeled into, you wouldn't want to make noises you wouldn't hear on an aircraft. That's all part of health tech. That was down at, people used to say, "What is it all about?" I say, Holby City. I think of another thing now because it's stopped, hasn't it, Holby? But yeah, there is kit. Even the drugs are given through kit. So if you think of everyone listening to this, I hope the vast majority will have been able to have their COVID vaccination. And you look at a COVID vaccination program, the vaccine's a medicine. It's hard not to say the star of the show of vaccination program isn't medicine, because it is. But the soloist is nothing without the orchestra. And that vaccine was delivered in a glass vial, which is a medical device. It's given through a needle and syringe, medical devices. Person given it, you would have been dripping in PPE, medical devices. So there's all of that. So our aim is to make sure people can get appropriate access to high quality health technology, as we would define it. And we do that in a number of ways, representing our industry. Probably the most important thing we do is we act as an important interlocutor between industry and government. So pandemic, obviously, it's hard not to talk about the pandemic. But if we look back the early days of the pandemic,
Yeah, it's a great point. At what point did you guys as a body kind of become either aware or involved in those discussions right at the beginning?
Pretty much immediately, Steve. And actually, this was industry associations across the board. I think we all said the pandemic did two things after Brexit, the referendum. The pandemic brought experts and industry back into fashion. Who are the people that knew the stuff that could help us, and who are the people that could deliver the technology? So pretty much from the outset. So in the very, very early days, we got involved in the ventilator challenge. One of my colleagues was on the team that looked at the whole regulatory makeup for that. Fascinating piece of work, because people found out it's not that easy just to stop building motor cars or vacuum cleaners or aeroplanes and start making ventilators. Very, very different. So we had a big input in the ventilator stuff from the word go. PPE challenge, of course, but all technologies. How do you keep the country running? So there's big discussions on trade. Where are the blockages in the world? Where are things getting stuck? How do we get around that? Big issues come up straight away. I mean, everything ran out, and one of the things I don't think any of us realise is to what extent goods are moved around the globe on aeroplanes in holds of passenger aircraft. It's why you can't take any baggage on aeroplanes. It's full of stuff in the hold. So we had to overcome all that. It was really, really, really kind of interesting work, and we worked right the way through with the pandemic. And actually, I think all industry sectors would say this as well. We had a tremendous engagement with government. We probably had more ministerial engagement in that 18 months, 2 years than we had in the previous decade, possibly.
But is that presumably, though, that's not like, it's kind of a shame that it took a global pandemic to, get to that point. I would assume that actually, Brexit did us a bit of a favour, because we'd stress tested our supply chain resilience almost to the point of destruction. With so many cliff edges. We got really good at making sure our supply chains were intact. And everybody was telling you, no one's supposed to stockpile. Hospitals not supposed to stockpile. I'm on the board of a hospital, and we didn't stockpile, but we made sure we weren't going to run out if we hit one of those Brexit edges. So it was actually a good exercise in preparation, and the level of detail that people went into across government to prepare for those anticipated or feared Brexit cliff edges probably served us quite well in the pandemic. And the fact we also had, they've had a bad rap, I think, from some parts of the media, but we have a really good, strong distribution network. People that can source stock, source good quality stock, and deliver it to the NHS for the benefit of patients, and also healthcare professionals. A lot of that stuff was protected. To your point at the beginning of the show, I think that in effect, almost everything that you come into contact with when you enter a hospital is a medical device, is a piece of health technology. If you're unfortunate enough to have to go into hospital, once you move past reception into a ward or into a screening room or whatever, every single piece in there is part of the health technology ecosystem and will almost certainly qualify as some kind of medical device. And I think people, to your point around, it's not that easy to suddenly spin up making medical grade ventilators, right? Like medical devices, there's a huge amount of rigor and regulatory oversight and documentation and testing and verification and validation that has to happen and should happen before any single device goes onto the market. So there isn't a very easy way to spin this stuff up particularly quickly, right?
Absolutely right. And the quality standards are very, very high. Some companies we work with, obviously won't name them, but people say, well, we'll never buy products from them again because it's had no quality management systems. Colleagues from the aircraft industry actually were amazed about the quality standards that even small. You know this yourself, Steve.
Yeah, we're ISO 13485. It was one of the first things that we did. ISO 13485 registered. For those of you that aren't quality management system aficionados, is basically the internationally recognized certification, audited certification of what's called a quality management system, which in effect is a step-by-step prescription around how you develop products to the highest quality within your company. And effectively is the Bible that everyone in the company has to follow about how to run the company. It's extremely detailed.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's right too. I mean, we may well get on and talk about some of the finer points of regulation, but regulation in any sector is there to protect consumers. And there's a sort of misconception that our industry wants light touch soft regulation. That's simply not the case. People choose to work in our industry for a reason. It's by and large because they want to help people. And I've always believed there's a point which everybody we interact with, whether they're scientists, they're doctors, the hospital administrators, they're guys out there selling the kit in hospitals, they're clinical support people. We've all, people like myself in industry bodies, we've all got different things to do every day. But if we get it right, there'll be an overlap, and that point will be the overlap at which people get access to appropriate access to high quality, as safe as it can be. And that's probably worth a discussion.
Yeah.
Because one of the ways devices have been regulated traditionally under the European system is this balance, this risk and benefit. And it's a discussion we never want to have. What are the risks associated with any intervention? Any medical intervention is not free from risk. But we don't always want to have that discussion, particularly when we're sick. We want to go to get fixed quickly, safely, pain-free, without any consequences. And what are the trade-offs? What happens?
Yeah.
I think sometimes when people get worked up about regulation, is it fit for purpose? They don't want to have that sort of honest conversation about, okay, we need to understand the risks as well as the benefits. And actually, and the level of data you need to provide, as you will know, Steve, for to be certified for a medical device does depend, certainly the European system, on the level of risk presented by that device.
Yeah, and I think that's fair enough, right? Like if you, on the one hand, you have a thermometer, for example, that doesn't carry as much medical risk as a spinal implant, for example, and those things should not be treated the same.
Yeah,
quite evidently, and I don't think anyone would really argue different or should argue different. That being said, the thing that I think a lot of people, I don't want to turn the whole show into a debate, into a discussion around regulations, but what I think people don't necessarily realize is that the development of a medical device starts with understanding how the user will use it, what the user will use it for. And you build your requirements and your design and your verification all the way back from the beginning around how do I think, or we think, the user will use this? What are their requirements? So the requirement of a thermometer is, well, they might stick it in their mouth and leave it there for 5 minutes and the glass need not break and whatever it is. Whereas the user requirements associated with the spinal implant are going to be unbelievably extensive.
Yeah, dead right, Steve. And we're engineers, and people always worry about CE marking. Well, what does that mean? Well, actually, CE mark tells you it'll do no harm and it does what it says on the tin. But the level of evidence you need does depend on that as well.
And so it should do. And it
absolutely
should
do. Right.
Yeah. And I think like a really good example is the COVID lateral flow test, right? So like, Innova and that whole crew of those people, like obviously they had their clinical data that said it was, 150% accurate or whatever it was that their clinical data said. But in reality, when they were tested at Port and Down and things like that, it came back and they were like, in practice, it was sort of 70-75%. But the government made a risk benefit analysis, which was that actually on the whole, we're prepared to take the lower accuracy for the massive, massive benefit of access to testing and affordability of testing, because we fundamentally cannot process all of those tests through the laboratory system, but we still need that to happen because of if we don't test people and we have this virus uncontrolled in the ecosystem, deaths will be significantly higher. So they took that trade-off knowingly.
Exactly the trade-off we were talking about, Steve. And then your appetite for risk will depend, will switch as well, wouldn't it, depending on what situation you're in and what you're in. Your condition might be. I mean, if you've got an ingrowing toenail, your appetite for the risk of a treatment would be a lot less than it would be if you had late stage pancreatic cancer, then when you frankly wouldn't be too worried about the side effects of any treatment that was offered to you.
Yeah, and I think so. Know a number of people in the drug discovery space, and I didn't realize until I started speaking to them that a lot of the experimental drugs in that space are tested on people in exactly that situation, where they are in that end of life situation, and unfortunately they are in a terminal situation, and so they're like, yeah, sure, there's very little downside to me in having a go at this, whereas you can't test it on someone that's in stage 1 because that isn't the right thing to do. So what's your view on this idea that regulation stifles innovation?
Well, it shouldn't. So you need a balance. Having said that, we are there. Regulation is there to protect consumers. Bad regulation, it's not good regulation to deny people timely access to devices when they're indicated. And there've been examples of this in the past all over the world, of where regulators have been very, very slow. And the big one, actually, the one that I remember very early in my career was implantable cardioverter defibrillators. So these things that people don't know, they're described as the ER room. I hate the ER room, but ER room in your chest.
Is that a pacemaker? No.
It looks like a pacemaker. If you or I look to it, it's not like a pacemaker. It looks like a pacemaker. It's implanted in the same way, but it sits inside your chest, bleeds on your heart. If you're at risk from a cardiac arrhythmia, so an abnormal heart rhythm,
right?
If you go into a certain type of abnormal heart rhythm, ventricular fibrillation, you'll die unless it's corrected. And the only way to correct it is by electricity. So the paddles you see on Holby City and all the movies, it's an internal version of one of those. So it sits there, it monitors your heart 24 hours a day, and if you go into a shockable cardiac arrhythmia, it will deliver a shock there and then. So those devices were available in Europe a long time before they were available in the United States.
And why was that?
Well, this represents a really interesting shift in how people have thought about regulation. Regulation in the US was considered, for most of my career, and I've been in devices since '97, this sort of space a little bit before that. Regulation in the US was considered to be very costly, very, very slow, very, very cumbersome. The EU was seen to be a little bit more responsive, quicker. But regulation evolves, and the current medical device directives are known as came out in the early 1990s. They serve patients well. They allow patients access to timely interventions like ICDs, implantable cardioverter defibrillators. So European patients, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of lives were probably saved by ICDs versus other people that took a more conservative approach to regulation. So it's about getting that balance right. Medical device directives in Europe are now being changed. It's fair to say it is a more burdensome and cumbersome process than it was at one point. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's about getting the balance right. At the same time, the US is taking a slightly different view. The FDA is taking a slightly different view and said, okay, we recognize in the past we were slow. Our patients were slow at getting access to proven technologies. So the FDA, over the course of probably the last Food and Drug Administration, the regulator in the US, over the past 6, 7, 8 years or so, it's kind of reinvented itself. It's become very innovation friendly. It's set itself metrics to be the first market in the world to access certain innovations.
Okay, I didn't know that. Like, what stuff does it want to be the first in?
If you look at various kind of intervention, my early background was interventional cardiology. Now I always thought at that time, intervention in the vascular tree, you can use the same kind of looking technologies that you're using in the coronary arteries, you can use them in any bit of the vascular tree. Stents are going all over the body. Those kind of things. The interesting thing about devices, probably more so than pharmaceuticals, is certainly the pace is they're iterative. So
yeah,
we're engineers, we build a device that can help.
Well, that's exactly where we think, and particularly the more devices that include software, which is obviously has the more devices that include software in terms of their diagnostic, has an unbelievable capacity to scale and innovate and iterate and improve, right?
Yeah, so I mean, ICD, we were talking about ICD, and ICD has got actually diagnostic in it. It's monitoring your heart. It's it's a real-time monitor. So the switch now, just to finish that point, the switch now is that with what's happening in the US, Europe is being seen as a less favourable place for innovation, and the new regulations are more demanding.
Do you mean Europe outside of the UK, or do you mean Europe including the UK? Like, what are we doing? What are we saying these days? What do we say?
At the moment, regulatory-wise, European regulation is our regulation. Okay, you've got CA mark. A lot of
exactly. It's just, they just took the regulations over wholesale, pretty much.
A lot of people go that route, and the demands placed on companies and regulators with the new MDR, medical device regulation, is and that includes your kind of stuff, in vitro diagnostic as well. IVD stands for in vitro diagnostic medical device. That times it's got more burdens to the extent that regulators are pulled out of that market. So there is a system whereby your device is effectively approved by a thing called a notified body. And they're independent organisations. At one time, there were 80, 90 plus across Europe. We've seen that plummet down to maybe 40 or so at the moment, who are able to do that just because it's so difficult. That puts a lot of pressure on innovators to get their products regulated. So now they're beginning to think, well, hang on a minute, why wouldn't we look at somewhere else where it's easier to get approvals? There isn't that constraint on capacity, and there's a shortage of regulators all over the world. Shortage of doctors, shortage of engineers, shortage of regulators, and people listed. It's a fantastic career. You'll never be out of a job as a competent regulatory affairs professional. That's when you start climbing a ladder. Regulatory strategy is a really, really fascinating part of the world. So we then have a balance of, as an innovator, where I'm going to go. And we're hearing a lot from UK-based innovators, probably slightly further down the line than where you are, Steve, that, okay, do we want to go into Europe? It's slow. Where, as a small company particularly, it's difficult for us to get regulation. Or do we go to the US? US regulatory affairs professionals will tell you, the guys, consultants will tell you, they spent the first half of their career teaching people how to get CE mark so they can get into Europe. They're now spending their career telling people how to get to FDA regulation.
Yeah, I mean, our
FDA
documentation is already under review, so we're going UK US for exactly that reason. It's just there's such a layer of complexity associated with Europe. I mean, each market is different. Obviously, even though you have a CE mark, you still have to approach each market completely differently. And so it's just it's sort of very complex. Whereas the US is obviously one homogenous market, one regulatory authority that you have to deal with, and like you say, they're actually pretty proactive. So how does that flow back into this vision, or this kind of vision that certainly under the Boris Johnson government during the pandemic and post-pandemic, this vision of sort of Britain as sort of life sciences, medical technology, health technology, innovation flagship country? Like, how do you view, what's your view on that sort of vision that, well, I think probably people could probably agree that that's sort of what they would like us to perceive from the media, particularly post-pandemic. But what's your kind of professional view on that?
So let's take the regulatory aspect of that first, and then maybe go across, because we're at an interesting point in our history now, aren't we? With Brexit, we are in a position where our approach to regulation offers enormous opportunities. So the number of companies that will manufacture in the UK only for the NHS market is vanishingly small, probably hardly any in our books, if any. So they're going to look at, traditionally they would always go for CE mark first, go for CE mark, gets you to UK, gets you to Europe, and then think elsewhere. So at the moment now, we've got to make a decision. We need to come up with our own sovereign regulations. If they are additional additive to anything else of other markets, the big European market on our doorstep, or the massive market in the US, that is going to detract from this as a favourable place to do.
Yeah, I can't see. They can't. If they do that, then it's going to be there'd be a bit. If they make it harder to get a device regulated in the UK than the US or the EU, then that's going to be a road to nowhere.
That is a problem at the moment. We're taking this really interesting view at the moment. Now, bear in mind, regulation is there to protect consumers, protect patients. If you look at the content of regulation, it's 85%. You know this, you're doing your regulations, you've done your UK, European stuff. The content is 85%. What changes is the process, right? So, and as you quite rightly identified, you'll have a very different experience in different European countries, even though you've got this true mutual recognition system. So, at the moment, so if you would say, well, MDR is put in terms of content to protect consumers, it's probably the gold standard. So at the moment, we're unilaterally accepting. If you've got a CE mark, you will unilaterally accept your product to the UK market. Well, we're in a position now by the things you never thought you hear yourself say, by the freedoms afforded to us by Brexit, we can choose who we align with, whose regulation we will unilaterally accept. We're currently accepting the CE marking. Why would we not take that more permanently? This is something that the Institute of Economic Affairs put out, that Jacob Rees-Mogg actually said was good from a trade perspective.
Jacob Rees-Mogg said that we should take the EU regulation on medical devices.
Yeah, well, it's not just medical devices, it's CE marking. If you look around.
Oh, CE mark. Oh wow, he said we should accept everything CE mark.
Yeah, and that also facilitates trade. But why not look at other trusted jurisdictions as well? So like the US, okay, some companies don't have a regulator like the MHRA. Some countries, they tend to be developing countries with nothing much in the way of indigenous regulation. Indigenous health tech industry, but they'll do exactly that. They'll say, okay, you've got CE, you've got FDA, you've been approved in Singapore. Then we will accept your product onto our market with a simple registration process. So the more I think about that, is I can't think of any other way we're absolutely able to guarantee continued product supply, particularly if people start beginning to look away from Europe. We don't need to hang ourselves on Europe to the extent we have done. We can look globally, and that is a real opportunity for us, whilst of course making sure the products that we get as patients are safe. That's the regulatory element of that vision. The other bit of the vision is the back end of it. The bit I guarantee you're struggling with at the moment, Steve, is adoption spread. The UK is not always seen as the best place to do that. It tends to be a difficult market. So we need to focus on that bit. We have a life sciences vision, which talks about building on our science base and making the NHS the driver of innovation in our country, because it's a huge employer and all the economic output associated with that, but also creating an outstanding business environment for companies in the life sciences sector. And we don't always do that practically, because this is not the easiest market to access.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because, sample of one, and we're based in Cambridge, and it's a huge cluster for life sciences and health technology, and there are others. There's Scotland's doing fantastically well, and Bristol and Oxford, and there's lots of really great stuff coming in. I think what I think that the UK government needs to try and figure out. I also think that there's a huge amount of innovation coming out of academia as well in this country. So I think the actual intellectualism of the innovations is okay. I think it's more a bit like you say, the support of that moving into commercially viable businesses, and that then being supported adequately, whether that's with investment funding, whether that's with research funding, whether it's with, routes into the NHS. I mean, I think the NHS historically, over the last 10 or 15 years has really recognized that pathway for innovators is hard, but it's also really hard to change that. It's easy to identify problems in the NHS, but it's significantly harder to do anything about them. So I don't think it's a lack of will. I think it's more of it's a big system, to try and adjust. Yeah,
and there's an imbalance. There are, there are 15 organisations called academic health science networks that cover.
Oh yeah.
In fact, we're in Belfast next week talking about how to create something like that for Northern Ireland.
Cool.
And they had a great slide, a penny farthing, basically.
Yeah.
Says, in the real world, you take a big company, any big company in another industry. The small wheel of the penny farthing is the amount of money they spend on R&D. The big wheel is the amount of money they spend on adoption and spread. The NHS is the way around. So I think we kind of, in some ways, the basic clinical research is the easy bit. The adoption and spread, because you've got to change pathways, is the difficult bit. So that, and also we're good at that early bit as well. I mean, you're speaking from Cambridge. I mean, nowhere on the planet can bet Cambridge for basic science. But so that's how we possibly need to think about our developing health and care system. And again, I think we've got an opportunity with this move to integrated care. So you talk about having to break down so many barriers. One of the biggest but most significant barriers and consistent barriers was this ability where you invest in one part of the system. So you invest in your technology, Steve. Lipid monitoring is the best thing, because the benefit is going to be realised further down in the system where people aren't presented to in a hospital. But there are no financial linkages between the people paying for your test and the people receiving the benefit.
It's a classic. Yeah, there's a classic, and it's like the classic freakonomics of the NHS, isn't it? It's sort of like everyone can agree that something's a good idea, but no one quite knows where that money will come from, because even though it is a good idea conceptually, no one can actually work out the cost benefit analysis on their kind of balance sheet, right? Yeah. Like a classic one I heard was around like urine testing, like UTI testing in care homes. So UTIs are one of the single biggest reasons people get moved from a care home into a hospital. Okay, but
when they don't need to be,
they don't need to be. So, but who's going to pay for routine UTI testing in care homes? Well, the care homes are run privately and they're on a shoestring. So why would they care? Because if a patient goes to hospital, they don't pay for the patient going to hospital, right? Should it be the local GP in primary care that pays for that? Instead, well, those people aren't in primary care and they don't go to primary care, they go to hospital for that. So should it be the hospital? So what, like, but is it the hospital that pays? Are we now saying that hospitals will pay money out in the community to stop people coming to hospital? So it gets very confusing as to who's actually going to pick up the bill.
Some forward-thinking trust did that. They would deploy nurses, recruit nurses and deploy them in the local social care, because there wasn't the capability and capacity there to stop people getting UTIs, to be coming as an emergency and then not be able to be discharged back to a system.
Well, that's the other thing. You get stuck in the system, right?
Yeah,
and then that just clogs it all up.
Yeah, it clogs it all, and it did make financial sense for those hospitals to pay for that, because it increased their capacity to be able to do.
I think now if someone revisited it, or if it does revisit it, because it may be having such an impact on bed blocking, that might make more sense, right? Because the bed blocking is so critical. It's such a critical issue.
We've really got to think about the financial flows, because in that model I just described, it made financial sense for the hospital pay, because they freed up the beds, they could do more activity they got paid for. We're moving away from a national tariff for payment by service. So that's what we've got to take this leap of faith and say, we are literally, I hate horrible saying, but we're in this together. It's down for all of us to invest, to make sure that, and we have a plan. We have the NHS long-term plan, which read that. It's all about going as far downstream as possible. That includes neonatal health, maternal health, health of young people, to prevent the point where people prevent at the most resource-intensive bit of our health and care system, which is the accident emergency department, and generally to keep people off of our hospital estate that don't need to be there. And technology's got a huge role to play in that, and it's also a more sustainable way to deliver healthcare. And guess what? What is probably the biggest burning platform of our lifetime, for our children's lifetime, beyond global pandemics and World War III starting in the Ukraine, it is an antimicrobial resistance. It's exactly that, isn't it?
Yeah, no, of course. And so what is the mission? What is ABHI's mission, or how is it dealing with these really broad, really complex themes? I mean, because any one of these things is just an extremely detailed, complicated business in and of itself. So obviously you have your mission, but you're also representing your members. And so how do you guys handle that?
Yes, so, I mean, we basically communicated recently. We've got two priorities really: growth and regulation, and that is growth of our industry, of our companies. I don't think there's any we should be embarrassed about that. We're an industry representative body, but it is also about growing the capacity of health and care systems the world over, actually, to be able to treat more patients, do that more efficiently in all the stuff we've just talked about now. How does the technology play that role? How can we deliver more and more care out of hospitals? Diagnostics has got a massive role to play in that. That we talk a lot about early diagnosis. How can we intervene earlier and earlier? And what we're trying to do, isn't it, is help people live healthier lives for longer. There's always going to be that huge amount of resource towards the end of life. But how do we extend the number of years you live in a healthy life? Because in many ways, health and care systems in the developed world have been a victim of their own success, haven't they? The NHS was founded partly on the belief that if you made people healthy, you spend less money on healthcare. Well, that's not right.
That's gone the other way, right? And it's not that spending money on healthcare hasn't made people sicker. That's obviously a silly thing to suggest, but there are more people who are sicker more of the time.
The problem is, I mean, people say the NHS has failed. Well, it's not failing. It's very good at delivering what it was designed to deliver, which is to treat people with acute episodes of discrete illness.
Yeah.
Now we've got populations that we have to treat with multiple morbidities, care for them for decades.
And also, like, it's not. I think saying the NHS is failing is so harsh, because first of all, it's just never that simple. But second of all, it's a lot of the issues within the system are around very systemic global themes, like global lack of doctors, global lack of nurses, global lack of healthcare advisors, or like there's just there's a limit to how much you can deliver. Like, you need someone to put a cannula in someone's hand, for example. Just making more cannulas or better cannulas, that's not going to resolve the underlying issue.
No, but better cannulas will help if they're easy
to
stay there long.
I give you that.
But other forms of technology that can develop, and so we talked about. You mentioned pacemaker, actually. So if you look at we were doing some work recently on this debate: does the cost of technology fall over time? Well, it does. In 1980, let's say, a pacemaker probably cost the equivalent of a mini motor park, and it would be massive. You'd have to go in and basically you'd have your chest sawn open, your ribs fall apart. You'd be implanted in a procedure that would take several hours. You'd get sewn up again. You'd be on ICU for 48 hours, and then probably an inpatient for a couple of weeks. Now you can buy a pacemaker with the computational power, the functionality and battery longevity unimaginable back then, for a couple of £100. Similarly, if you look at interventional cardiology, again in a shorter time period for a disease that would have been treated in the 1980s with a coronary artery bypass, long hospital stage, hugely procedure times, same profile of disease is now being treated by a hole in the wrist. You're in and out in the same day. You don't even have to take your trousers off. So that is making the case for technology to generate those efficiencies, as well as being able to deliver care in different settings. In nursing homes, you talk a lot about hospital home virtual wards. It's absolutely what we're going to have to do. Virtual clinics, virtually outpatient clinics, remote following. Technology exists to do that. Yeah,
and I agree. And technologies like PocDoc exist to allow blood testing to be done anywhere outside of the clinical setting, because screening for major diseases has to take place.
Steve, you're part of the solution, and that is the future. Readily available diagnostic, cheap, reliable diagnostics that you can buy on the high street. That is the future. And some companies are famously in that space, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you think the major trends are going to be that we need to be aware of, that you guys are tracking for the next few years?
Really interesting question, that, isn't it? So we talk a lot about technology and all the exciting stuff, but demographic changes in the world, the fact that the stuff we talked about, we're all getting older, we're living with multiple morbidities, means that we're going to continue. A lot of devices that are being used today will still be the mainstream medical treatment. So you look at orthopedics, people have been talking about for many years about regenerative medicine being putting orthopedic surgeons out of business. Technology there is that's still difficult. It's very, very difficult to get those kind of biopharmaceutical agents into large joints. And before we get close to that, more and more of us are going to get to the stage where we need new knees, new hips. More of us will get short-sighted with our cataracts removed. So traditional medical devices, I think, are going to remain the mainstay of treatment, but they will be supported by innovation, particularly advances in innovative surgical interventions. We've kind of hinted at it just, haven't I, about minimally invasive surgery. Will shorten procedure times, make it easier, quicker, and safer. And then robotic assisted surgery. Robotic assisted surgery is one of those I think has moved quicker than I anticipated. So my own experience as a hospital, a few years ago, we had the first particular brand of robotic surgery in the NHS in our hospital, and it was for self-payers. People who were prepared to pay, didn't want to wait, could afford to jump the waiting list. Very quickly, the insurers started paying for it. Once one insurer pays, everyone else pays. And now it's part of a major National Institute for Health Research trial. And that technology is the price, the size, and all the barriers to the adoption of robotic assisted surgery are being moved very, very quickly. And then I think we're a long way off, autonomous robotic surgery, but we will see advances in virtual reality and augmented reality, which will allow the more routine use of remote surgery, so a kind of hub and spoke model. And alongside that, advances in things like 3D printing, which is there's some fantastic applications of 3D printing at the moment for surgical planning. So you'll scan someone, and then you'll build a model of it. Maybe I saw it very early on in Alder Hey, so a model of an organ, a child with kidney disease. The surgeons will be able to look and say, okay, this is the approach we need to take place. Of course, devices are coming down all the time, and then I think there's the one that's going to be a real challenge for us all from a regulatory perspective is the convergence of traditional devices, diagnostics, and information technology, but real mainstream information technology. So the first thing, I did some work in diabetes at the sort of turn of the century. Through an acquisition, I ended up writing a nice submission for insulin pumps.
Okay, cool.
Deliver your insulin. At that time, so this is 2000, we probably started on that. At that time, and it does exist, and it did exist, as well as your insulin pumps, I think it's going to give you insulin, continuous glucose monitors. And there has been this sort of technology to make them talk to each other. So you're describing essentially an artificial pancreas. And that was always stubbornly about 5 years away, remained about 5 years away. And I think, I could remember, I think the first kind of versions of that are beginning to get.
I think they're coming out. I think they're coming out now,
Except they've been here for years because tech savvy type.
They hacked it themselves. They did it themselves, didn't they?
Yeah, they've got an insulin pump. They've got a glucose monitor. They're downloading software from open source, and they're doing it self, and they're doing it out with the view of the manufacturers, but also regulators. So that's going to be a really, really interesting challenge for all of us.
For sure.
And not least in your space, Steve, what do you do with when people can see into the results they're getting, and where does that direct them? How does that direct them? And is it beyond the diagnostic? Is it an insulin pump connected to diagnostic?
Cool. Well, Richard, we've run out of time in the show. Wow, that was it.
We haven't really talked about anything, have we?
No, we did. We've covered a lot of ground. So that was it. There we go. So Richard, thank you very much for coming on. Much appreciated. And thank you to everyone for listening.
Thanks, Steve. It's good to speak to you.
Yeah, Richard Phillips, Strategy Director at the ABHI. How do people, if people want to find out more about the ABHI, where do they go, Richard?
www.abhi.org.uk. Loads of stuff on there. And you'll be able to contact us through that, get a sense of what we're up to. Always lots of events going on, always lots of stuff going out, news, information, and reports on some of the meetings we're having.
Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks. Bye-bye.